I'm 17, and this happened a couple of weeks ago while my mom was out of town on a business trip. We live in a pretty small town, and the kind of thing I'm about to tell you doesn't really happen here, or at least that's what I thought. The day started out normal enough. It was one of those days where the snow just doesn't stop. I think the news said we were supposed to get something like a foot of snow that weekend, so I was basically snowed in. My mom had left me a bunch of food before she left. Frozen pizzas, snacks, the usual, so I wasn't worried about starving or anything. I spent most of the day lounging around, watching movies, scrolling through my phone, normal stuff. The snowstorm outside made it kind of cozy, honestly. The wind would howl every so often, and the trees in the backyard were creaking, but I wasn't scared or anything. It was just winter. Everything was fine until later that night, maybe around 8 p.m. I was in the kitchen heating up pizza when I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a branch breaking under the weight of the snow, but then I realized it sounded more deliberate, like footsteps. They were crunching through the snow, coming up to the front porch. My first thought was that maybe it was a neighbor checking on me, which isn't totally weird for our neighborhood. But then the footsteps stopped right by the door. No knock, no doorbell, just silence. I froze, staring at the door from the kitchen. It felt like forever, but it was probably only a minute or so before I heard the footsteps again, this time heading away from the house. Okay, weird, but I told myself it was probably just someone walking their dog or something. I went back to eating and watching TV, but the whole thing left me feeling kind of uneasy. About an hour later, things got worse. I was upstairs in my room when I heard a loud thump coming from the back of the house. It wasn't subtle either. It sounded like something or someone had slammed against the back door. My heart was racing as I crept downstairs to check it out. That's when I saw him. There was a man standing at the glass door that leads to our backyard. He looked to be in his 40s, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. His face was kind of hidden under a hood, but I could tell he was staring right at me. I didn't open the door, obviously, but I called out, "Can I help you?" He didn't answer at first. He just stood there, and then he pressed his hand against the glass like he was testing it. Finally, he said, "I need to come in. It's freezing out here." Something about his voice made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the situation. It was the way he said it, like he wasn't asking for help but demanding it. "I can't let you in," I told him. "I'm sorry." He didn't like that. His face twisted into this angry snarl, and he started pounding on the glass, harder and harder. "Let me in. Let me in." At that point, I panicked. I grabbed my phone and tried to call the police, but of course, because the storm had been messing with everything, the call wouldn't go through. I tried again and again, but all I got was a dead tone. Meanwhile, the guy was still banging on the door, shouting things I couldn't even make out. It sounded like he was losing it. I ran upstairs and locked myself in my room, hoping he'd think the house was empty if I didn't make any noise. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, the banging stopped. I didn't hear anything at all. No footsteps, no shouting, just silence. I waited another few minutes before creeping back downstairs to see if he was gone. The backyard was empty, and there weren't any footprints leading away from the house. It was like he had just vanished. Finally, I managed to get a call through to the police. They said they'd send someone out to check the area, but by the time they arrived, the guy was long gone. The scariest part? There was no sign of him anywhere. No footprints, no marks on the door where he'd been pounding. Nothing. It was like he'd never been there. I told my mom about it the next morning, and she freaked out, obviously. She came home early from her trip, and we had extra locks installed on all the doors and windows. I haven't seen the guy since, but I still feel like I'm being watched sometimes, especially at night. I'm a DoorDash driver, and after a long night of deliveries, I was on my way home, exhausted and ready to crash. It was just past midnight, and I was driving through one of those rural areas where the only lights come from your car's headlights. I was maybe 10 minutes from home when I saw him, a guy standing right in the middle of the road. He wasn't waving or anything, just standing there like he was waiting for someone to hit him. I slammed on my brakes and stopped a few feet in front of him. I should have just kept driving. He was wearing a dirty jacket, jeans that looked like they'd been through a war, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. As I sat there, he slowly walked up to the driver's side window. My gut was screaming at me to hit the gas, but instead, I rolled down the window just a crack. "Hey, man, my car broke down," he said, his voice low and scratchy. "Can you give me a lift into town?" I hesitated. Everything about this felt off. But then I thought, what if he's just some unlucky guy who actually needs help? So, against my better judgment, I unlocked the doors and told him to hop in. He climbed into the passenger seat, and as soon as he shut the door, I regretted it. The smell hit me first, like sweat and damp clothes. He didn't say anything at first, just looked around the car like he was taking inventory. His eyes lingered on the back seat for a little too long, and I noticed he had a backpack sitting on his lap. I tried to make small talk to break the tension. "So, where are you headed?" "Just into town," he said, still scanning the car. His hands gripped the straps of his backpack so tightly his knuckles were white. That's when I noticed it. The zipper on his backpack was slightly open, and I could see a length of rope sticking out. My stomach dropped. I tried to keep calm, but my heart was pounding. Then I saw his hand. He was holding something in his lap. A knife. It wasn't huge, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I was mentally screaming at myself for letting him in the car. I needed to get out of this, but I didn't want to make any sudden moves. "Hey," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Why don't you pull over up there? I need to, grab something from my bag." I nodded, trying to act calm, and pulled over onto the shoulder. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. As soon as the car stopped, he turned to me and said, "Actually, why don't you hop in the back seat? It'll be more comfortable for both of us." That was it. I knew I had to make a move or I wasn't getting out of this. "Sure," I said, pretending to go along with it. As I reached for the door handle, I made it look like I was just getting out to switch seats. The second my feet hit the ground, I bolted. I didn't even look back. I just ran into the tall grass on the side of the road, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I crouched low and tried to stay as quiet as possible. From the grass, I could hear him yelling, "Hey, get back here." His voice sounded angrier and closer than I expected. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, as I heard his footsteps crunching on the gravel near the car. After a few minutes, the yelling stopped. I waited even longer, not trusting that he'd given up so easily. When I finally felt safe enough to move, I pulled out my phone. Thank God I had service. I called 911 and told them everything. It felt like an eternity before the cops showed up. When they did, they found my car abandoned on the side of the road. The guy was gone, but his backpack was still in the passenger seat. Inside, they found a roll of duct tape, more rope, and zip ties. The officers told me I was incredibly lucky. They said it didn't look like he was trying to rob me. He had something much worse in mind. This was last winter, right after Christmas, when I was driving home from visiting my family. I've done the drive a few times before. It's about 10 hours. But this time, the weather turned into a nightmare halfway through. The forecast had called for snow, but I figured it wouldn't be anything I couldn't handle. I left early in the morning, hoping to beat the worst of it, but by the time I was 5 hours in, the snow was coming down hard. The roads were a mess, visibility was garbage, and I had to slow way down. At that point, I just wanted to make it home before nightfall because driving in the dark in that kind of weather? No thanks. I was on this long, empty stretch of road through the woods when I saw hazard lights up ahead. At first, I couldn't even tell what it was because the snow was blowing around so much. But as I got closer, I realized it was a car stuck sideways across the road. I slowed down and rolled down my window a little as I approached. There was a guy standing next to the car waving at me, and he looked desperate. He wasn't wearing much for how cold it was, just a jacket and jeans, and he was covered in snow. He came up to my window and asked if I could help him push his car. Now, normally I just call roadside assistance or something, but out here, there was no cell signal. I figured the guy was probably freezing, and honestly, it didn't feel right to just leave him there. I told him I'd help, but only for a few minutes because I didn't want to get stuck myself. I pulled my car over to the side, leaving it running, and got out. The cold hit me like a brick, and the wind was insane. The guy led me to the back of his car, and as I got closer, I noticed something weird. The driver's side door was open just a crack, and I could hear him mumbling. At first, I thought he was talking to me, but then I realized he was talking to someone in the car. "Do you have passengers?" I asked, shouting over the wind. He froze for a second, then shook his head. No, it's just me." That immediately made me uneasy. I could have sworn I heard another voice, but maybe it was just the wind messing with me. Either way, I decided I'd give this one good push and then get the hell out of there. As we started pushing, I glanced into the car through the back window. I don't know why, I guess I was just curious. That's when I saw movement inside. There was definitely someone in the car. At least one person, maybe more, but they were ducked down, hiding. I stopped pushing and backed away. "Hey man," I said, trying to sound calm. "I think you've got people in your car." The guy straightened up and turned to face me. His whole vibe changed. He wasn't acting desperate anymore. He was just staring at me like he was sizing me up. "Nah," he said flatly. "You're imagining things." Before I could respond, the back doors of the car flew open and 3 men jumped out. I don't think I've ever been more scared in my life. They didn't say anything, they just started running straight toward me. I turned and sprinted back to my car. I could hear them yelling behind me, but I didn't look back. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the door open, but I managed to dive in and lock it just as one of them reached the window. I didn't even think. I slammed on the gas and swerved around their car, nearly getting stuck in the snowbank as I sped past. My tires were slipping like crazy, but somehow I got back on the road. I didn't stop driving for at least an hour, even though I was shaking so hard I could barely keep my hands on the wheel. When I finally reached a small town, I found a police station and told them everything. The officers took my statement and said they'd send someone to check it out, but I never heard anything after that. No follow-up call, nothing. I still don't know what those guys wanted, but it's pretty clear to me that it wasn't good. Maybe they were trying to carjack me, or maybe it was something worse. I try not to think about it too much because honestly, it freaks me out. The scariest part is how easily I could have ended up their victim. If I hadn't noticed those people in the car, if I'd hesitated even a second longer getting back to my own car, I don't even want to imagine what might have happened. I was driving home late at night after visiting a friend who lived a few hours out of town. The stretch of highway I was on was completely deserted. No cars, no lights, just miles of dark road and empty fields. About an hour into the drive, my car started making this horrible clunking noise. Before I could even pull over, it just died. Engine, lights, everything. I coasted to the side of the road and tried starting it again, but it wouldn't budge. And, of course, my phone had no service. Classic horror movie setup, right? I sat there for a while, hoping a car would pass by, but the highway was dead. The hours dragged on, and I was starting to get really nervous. The temperature was dropping, and the silence was deafening. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw headlights approaching. The vehicle slowed as it got closer, and I waved it down. It was an old black pickup truck, the kind that looked like it had seen better days. The driver rolled down his window, a man in his 50s, maybe 60s, with scruffy gray hair and a weathered face. "You need a ride?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I hesitated. I mean, hitchhiking is never a great idea, but what choice did I have? I nodded, grabbing my backpack and locking up my car before climbing into the passenger seat. The guy didn't say much at first, which was fine by me. But then, about 5 minutes into the drive, he started asking questions. "Where you headed? Why were you out here so late? You traveling alone?" Something about the way he asked made my skin crawl. His tone wasn't casual, it was almost too curious. I tried to keep my answers vague, not wanting to give away too much. As we drove, I noticed we weren't heading back toward the main road. Instead, he turned onto a narrow dirt path that cut through a dense patch of trees. I think the highway's back that way," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond. Panic started to creep in. My hand instinctively went to the door handle, but the truck was moving too fast for me to jump out safely. "Where are we going?" I asked louder this time. The man finally glanced at me, a twisted smirk creeping across his face. "Shortcut," he said. "Yeah, no, I wasn't buying it." The dirt road eventually opened up to a clearing, and in the middle of it was this decaying old farmhouse. The windows were shattered, the roof was caving in, and the whole place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The truck slowed to a stop, and the man turned off the engine. "End of the line," he said, reaching under his seat for something. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I threw open the door and bolted. Behind me, I heard him shouting, followed by the sound of heavy boots hitting the ground. My heart was pounding as I sprinted into the woods, branches scratching my face and arms. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, zigzagging through the trees in case he was following me. Eventually, I found a thick cluster of bushes and crawled into it, trying to catch my breath while staying hidden. The forest was eerily quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. At one point, I thought I heard his footsteps nearby, but I couldn't be sure. I stayed as still as possible, praying he wouldn't find me. After what felt like hours, I finally got a single bar of cell service. I shakily dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher about what had happened. They told me to stay put and that they'd send someone out. When the police arrived, they searched the area but didn't find the man or his truck. The farmhouse, they said, had been abandoned for years. There was no sign that anyone had been living there. I was shaken but relieved to be safe. The officers gave me a ride back to my car, and I had it towed the next day. This happened a couple of months ago, not long after I moved into a new house. I just bought the place, and it was my first time living alone, which was exciting but also a little nerve-wracking. It was one of those nights where the snow just wouldn't stop. Big, heavy flakes piling up everywhere. The whole neighborhood was blanketed in white, and everything was so quiet, like the snow was muffling all the sound. I was upstairs in my bedroom, just scrolling through my phone and listening to the wind outside. That's when I heard it. A weird thudding noise, like something heavy landing on the roof. At first, I thought it might just be snow sliding off, but the sound was too sharp, like actual footsteps or something being dropped. My stomach tightened. This was a pretty old house, and I'd already been stressing about potential issues like, what if the roof was sagging or the weight of the snow was too much? I decided to check it out. I threw on my coat and boots and stepped outside into the freezing night. The snow was still coming down, and the air was biting cold, but what immediately caught my eye was the roof. The snow on one side was completely clear, like someone had swept it off. It didn't make sense. It wasn't warm enough for anything to melt, and the other side was still covered. The whole thing made my skin crawl. I stood there for a minute trying to make sense of it, when I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow shifting near the edge of the roof. I froze, squinting through the snow, but whatever I thought I saw was gone. At that point, I was freaked out but trying to stay logical. Maybe a branch fell, or a stray cat or something climbed up there. Either way, I wasn't staying outside to investigate further. When I got back inside, that's when things got worse. I immediately noticed water puddles on the hardwood floor near the front door. At first, I thought I'd tracked in snow, but then I realized the puddles were too big. Like, someone else had been walking around inside, someone dripping wet. That's when I saw them. Boot prints. They were faint but definitely there, leading from the hallway toward the stairs. My stomach dropped. I hadn't heard anyone come in, but I'd been outside for a couple of minutes, and the front door locks automatically. How the hell could someone have gotten in? I tried to tell myself I was imagining things. I didn't see or hear anyone, right? But then I looked up the stairs, and my blood went cold. At the top of the staircase, my bedroom door was open. I'd left it closed when I went outside. My heart was pounding as I slowly made my way up the stairs. I didn't have a weapon or anything, just my phone, which felt completely useless. I was trying to convince myself I was overreacting when I stepped into my room and saw it. There was a figure standing at my window. I only caught a glimpse, tall, dressed in dark clothing. But as soon as I screamed, they bolted. They didn't go out the door, though. They went out the window. I ran to the window just in time to see them dropping into the backyard and disappearing into the trees. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911, but I somehow managed to call the police. When they got there, they found more boot prints in the snow around the house. The prints led from a tree in the backyard to the side of the house, right under my bedroom window. Apparently, the guy had climbed the tree to get in through the window, which I'd stupidly left unlocked. The officers checked the whole house and didn't find anyone else, but the boot prints inside showed that the guy had been walking around upstairs, probably while I was outside. They didn't take anything, though. My laptop, my TV, even my wallet were all untouched. That's what freaked me out the most. If they weren't there to rob me, then what did they want? The police said they patrol the area for the next few nights, but they didn't have much to go on. Whoever it was, they were gone, and without cameras or a clear description, there wasn't much they could do. I've always been pretty independent, sometimes to a fault. I hate relying on people, especially for stuff like rides, and I'll admit I've made some dumb decisions because of it. But this one taught me a lesson I'll never forget. It happened last Halloween. I was a sophomore in college, and my roommate, Alyssa, had convinced me to go to this huge Halloween party. I wasn't really feeling it. I had a ton of homework, and parties aren't exactly my thing, but she begged me and I caved. The party was at some off-campus house about 2 miles from our dorm. It was packed. People in costumes were spilling out onto the lawn, music was blasting, and the whole place reeked of beer and cheap perfume. I spent most of the night hanging out in the corner with a red Solo cup, trying not to look awkward while Alyssa danced and mingled. By the time midnight rolled around, I was done. My social battery was drained, and I was ready to crawl into bed. Alyssa wanted to stay, so I told her I'd head back to the dorms on my own. "Are you sure?" she asked, clearly buzzed. "You can Uber, right?" I waved her off. "I'll just walk. It's not that far." She frowned but didn't push it. I slipped out the front door, pulling my jacket tighter against the cool October air. The first part of the walk was fine. The streets were quiet, and the fog made everything look kind of eerie but also peaceful. I stuck to the sidewalks, listening to the sound of my boots on the pavement and the occasional distant shout of another partygoer. But then I noticed the car. It was an old, beat-up sedan, creeping along the street behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were lost or looking for parking. But when I turned a corner, they turned too. Okay, weird, I thought. I picked up my pace, glancing over my shoulder. The car kept following, its headlights cutting through the fog. My heart started to race. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a coincidence. But when the car pulled up beside me and slowed to a crawl, I knew it wasn't. The driver rolled down the window. He was a middle-aged guy, maybe in his 40s, with greasy hair and a creepy grin. "Hey," he called out. "You need a ride?" "No, I'm good," I said, not breaking stride. "Come on, it's late. It's not safe for you to be walking alone." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I shook my head and kept walking, hoping he'd take the hint. Instead, the car stopped. I heard the door open, and my stomach dropped. I didn't turn around, but I could hear his footsteps on the pavement, getting closer. "Hey!" he called again, louder this time. "Don't be rude. I'm just trying to help." I broke into a run. I don't think I've ever run that fast in my life. My boots weren't made for sprinting, and I could hear them slapping against the ground, echoing in the still night. "Come back here," he shouted, his voice sharp and angry now. I didn't look back. I just kept running, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. The fog made it hard to see where I was going, and my mind was racing with thoughts of what this guy might do if he caught me. Then, out of nowhere, I saw headlights coming toward me. Another car. The second car slowed as it approached, and I waved my arms frantically, hoping the driver would stop. They did. The door opened, and a guy stepped out. He looked vaguely familiar, and after a second, I recognized him from the party. I didn't know his name, but I'd seen him talking to Alyssa earlier. "You okay?" he asked, looking from me to the man still standing near his car. The creepy guy froze for a moment, then backed off. Without a word, he got back into his sedan and sped off into the fog. I stood there, shaking, as the party guy walked over to me. "Do you need a ride?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. Normally, I'd never get into a stranger's car, but at that moment, I didn't care. I nodded, and he opened the passenger door for me. The ride back to campus was quiet. I was still too shaken to say much, and he didn't push me to talk. When we got to the dorms, he waited until I was safely inside before driving off. The next day, I told Alyssa what had happened. She freaked out, saying I should have called her or at least taken an Uber. She was right, of course. I reported the incident to campus security, but there wasn't much they could do. I didn't get the guy's license plate, and I only had a vague description of him and his car. To this day, I can't stop thinking about what could have happened if that other car hadn't shown up when it did. I used to work as a delivery driver for this little sandwich shop, mostly doing night shifts since the tips were better. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it paid the bills, and I actually liked driving around late at night when the roads were quiet. That being said, one night changed how I feel about the job and honestly about driving at night forever. It was a regular Thursday night, close to the end of my shift. Around 11 p.m., I got an order for a sandwich and chips. Pretty standard stuff. The address was about 15 minutes away, so I grabbed the bag and hopped in my car. The roads were empty, as usual, and I was zoning out to some music when I hit this red light at an intersection. Normally, I'd blow through it if no one was around. Don't judge, it's late and I'm tired, but for some reason I stopped this time. While I'm sitting there, this black car pulls up in the lane next to me. It had the darkest tinted windows I've ever seen, like, so dark you couldn't see anything inside. Right away, I got this weird feeling in my stomach, like something was off. I didn't even want to glance over. I just stared straight ahead, waiting for the light to change. When it finally turned green, I hit the gas and drove off, but the black car just sat there, not moving. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and it was still at the light, like the driver was just sitting there watching me leave. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe they were on their phone or lost or whatever, but it stuck in my head. Anyway, I kept driving and eventually turned onto the street for the delivery. That's when things got even weirder. The address led me to a dead-end street lined with these brand new houses, but none of them looked lived in. No lights, no cars in the driveways, nothing. It was like the whole street was abandoned. I pulled up to the house number on the order and parked. The place looked empty too. No lights, no curtains, just bare windows and a dusty porch. At that point, I was starting to feel uneasy, but I figured maybe someone just hadn't moved in yet and wanted a late-night snack while unpacking or something. I grabbed the bag, walked up to the door, and knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and the door creaked open. Just a crack. I froze. The inside of the house was pitch black, but even in the dark, I could tell it wasn't lived in. There was no furniture, and the air smelled stale, like the place hadn't been touched in months. At that point, every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, so I backed away from the door and headed for my car. That's when I noticed it. The black car from the intersection was parked at the end of the street. Its headlights were off, and it was just sitting there, completely still. My stomach dropped. There was no way this was a coincidence. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just someone else who lived nearby, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was really, really wrong. I hurried to my car, fumbling with my keys, and that's when I saw it. In the reflection of my driver's side window, I spotted movement, a shadow shifting in my back seat. I froze. My hand was inches from the door handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Someone was in my car. My brain was screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. Finally, I snapped out of it and bolted back toward the house. I didn't care how creepy it was anymore. It was the closest place I could get to. As I made it to the porch, I heard a car door slam behind me. I turned just in time to see a man dressed in black sprinting from my car. Not toward me, but toward the black car at the end of the street. He jumped in, and the car peeled out of there so fast it fishtailed on the snow. I stood there shaking, watching the taillights disappear down the street. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. After a minute, I forced myself to go back to my car. The back door was still slightly open, and when I looked inside, there was nothing there, just the bag of food I was supposed to deliver. But the thought that someone had been in there, waiting for me, was enough to make me feel sick. I called the cops right away, and they showed up pretty quickly. I told them everything, from the weird car at the intersection to the guy in my back seat. When they checked out the house, they confirmed what I'd suspected. It was completely empty. One of the officers told me that the whole street was made up of new builds that hadn't been sold yet. Nobody was living there. The scariest part? The cops said they'd had multiple reports in the area of someone targeting delivery drivers. Apparently, this guy sneaks into cars when the drivers are distracted, either waiting to attack them or take their car. I don't even want to think about which. They didn't catch him that night, and as far as I know, he's still out there. I'll start this by saying my best friend Chris and I were at that age where we thought we were too cool for trick-or-treating but still wanted to do something fun on Halloween. We were in 8th grade, and the idea of walking around in costumes begging for candy felt lame. So, when Chris mentioned an old abandoned tunnel in the woods near his neighborhood, I jumped at the chance to check it out. It was one of those dumb ideas that only sounds fun when you're a kid. Chris swore it was creepy, but probably nothing, and we decided we'd just bike out there, take a quick look, and call it a night. We waited until it got dark to leave, which in hindsight was a terrible idea. Chris grabbed a flashlight from his dad's garage, and we rode out to the edge of the woods. It was chilly, the kind of cold that makes you wish you'd grabbed another layer but not enough to turn back for one. The trail into the woods was overgrown, and we had to ditch our bikes and walk the rest of the way. The tunnel wasn't super big, just wide enough for a car to fit through, though it looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Graffiti covered the walls, and the faint smell of mildew hit us as soon as we got close. I bet it's just like raccoons or something, Chris said, aiming the flashlight into the entrance. Yeah, or maybe a serial killer, I joked, trying to sound braver than I felt. We stepped inside, and the temperature seemed to drop immediately. The light from Chris's flashlight barely cut through the darkness, and the sound of our footsteps echoed weirdly, like the tunnel was bigger than it looked. We walked in maybe 20 feet before I started feeling uneasy. I couldn't explain why, but there was this wrongness about the place. It wasn't just the darkness or the damp smell. It was something heavier, like we weren't supposed to be there. Okay, this is kinda lame, I said, trying to laugh it off. Yeah, let's go a little further, Chris said, clearly more into it than I was. That's when we heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, just a faint whisper, too soft to make out. But then it got louder, like voices echoing from deep inside the tunnel. Did you hear that? Chris asked, his voice shaky. Yeah, I whispered. Let's get out of here. We turned back toward the entrance, but when the flashlight beam hit the opening, we both froze. There was a man standing there. He was backlit by the moonlight, so we couldn't see his face, but he wasn't moving. Just standing there, completely still, blocking the way out. What the? Chris started, but I grabbed his arm and yanked him back. Turn off the light, I hissed. Chris fumbled with the flashlight, and the tunnel plunged into darkness. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure the guy could hear it. We pressed ourselves against the wall, trying to stay as quiet as possible. After what felt like forever, we heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing off the walls. He was coming into the tunnel. We have to get out of here, I whispered. Chris nodded, and we started creeping along the wall, trying to move as quietly as possible. The footsteps kept getting closer, and I swear I could hear the sound of his breathing. When we got close to the entrance, Chris shone the flashlight for just a split second, enough to see that the man wasn't looking our way. Without thinking, we bolted. We ran past him and into the woods, not even stopping to grab our bikes. I could hear Chris panting behind me, and the sound of my own heartbeat drowned out everything else. When we finally stopped, we were deep in the woods, and everything was eerily quiet. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. Do you think he's following us? Chris asked, his voice trembling. I don't know, I said. But we're not going back that way. We circled around the woods for what felt like hours before we finally made it back to the road. When we got to Chris's house, his mom freaked out, asking why we were so dirty and out of breath. We didn't tell her the whole story, just that we got spooked in the woods. The next day, we went back to get our bikes. They were still there, but the tunnel looked different in the daylight, less menacing, but somehow still wrong. We didn't go inside, but we stood at the entrance for a minute, trying to convince ourselves it was just some random guy messing with us. But then Chris pointed to something on the ground. A crushed beer can and a pile of cigarette butts, like someone had been camping out there. We never figured out who the guy was or what he wanted. I was living in a tiny apartment, so when a family friend asked if I could house sit for them while they were out of town, I was actually kind of excited. It was a nice house, way bigger than my place, and all I had to do was water a few plants and feed the fish in this massive tank they had. I figured it'd be like a mini vacation. Spoiler, it was not. The first night started off fine. I got there in the evening, made myself some dinner, and was just lounging on the couch watching TV. It was nice having all that space to myself for once. Around 8 p.m., there was a knock at the door. Now, this wasn't exactly a neighborhood where you'd expect random visitors, especially at night. It was one of those quiet suburban streets where nothing ever happens. I figured maybe it was a neighbor or something, so I went to check it out. When I opened the door, there was this guy standing there. He was probably in his late 30s, wearing a baseball cap and a jacket, and he had this weird, too friendly smile. He said he was an old friend of the homeowner and wanted to see if they were around. Immediately, something felt off. First of all, if you're really a friend, wouldn't you know they were out of town? And second, why show up unannounced at night? I told him the homeowners were away and that I was just house-sitting. Oh, he said, nodding like he'd just remembered something. Then he smiled again, too wide, and said, no problem, I'll come back another time. I closed the door, locked it, and texted the homeowners to ask if they knew the guy. They replied almost instantly, saying they didn't know anyone matching that description. Okay, weird, but I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe he had the wrong house or something. Fast forward a few hours. It was getting late, and I was about to head to bed when there was another knock at the door. I froze. It was the same knock as before, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not loud, but just enough to send my heart racing. I went to the door and looked through the peephole. Sure enough, it was the same guy. This time, I didn't open the door. I just stood there, hoping he'd leave. After a minute, he knocked again, harder this time. Hey man, he called out, his voice muffled through the door. I think I left something here last time. Can you let me in real quick? I didn't respond. I just backed away from the door, grabbed my phone, and texted the homeowners again. They didn't reply right away, so I just stood there, waiting. After a few more knocks, the guy finally left, but I felt like I just dodged a bullet. I triple-checked that all the doors and windows were locked, then went upstairs to the guest bedroom. Couldn't relax, though. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept replaying the interaction in my head. Around midnight, I decided to check the house one last time before going to sleep. That's when I noticed it. The front door was unlocked. I swear to you, I know I locked it. I remember testing the handle after the guy left. But now it was wide open, just barely cracked. My stomach dropped. I rushed to grab my phone, which I'd left on the table near the couch, but it was gone. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. I grabbed my car keys and bolted out the front door. I didn't stop running until I was at the end of the street, where I finally called 911. The cops showed up pretty quickly and went through the house. At first, they didn't find anything, which almost made me feel like I was losing my mind. But then one of the officers called me over. They'd found the guy. He was sitting in the spare bedroom upstairs, just sitting there like he'd been waiting for something. He didn't say a word when they arrested him. He just kept staring straight ahead, completely calm. When they searched him, they found a key to the front door. It wasn't a copy of the key I had. It was something else, like a forged master key that somehow worked on the lock. I was shaking so badly I could barely answer the cops' questions. They asked me if I knew him or if the homeowners did, but I told them no. When the homeowners got back, they swore they didn't know him either. Here's the thing, though. The more I think about it, the more I feel like there's something they weren't telling me. The guy knew the layout of the house. He didn't even hesitate when the cops found him, like he expected to be there. Halloween has never been a big deal for me. I'm 32, single, and not exactly into spooky stuff, but I like the vibe of it. My plan this year was simple. Hand out candy, watch a couple of horror movies, and maybe crack open a beer or two. Nothing crazy. My neighborhood usually gets a decent amount of trick-or-treaters, so I figured I'd stay home and enjoy the evening. Started off quiet. Too quiet, actually. By 6:30 p.m., not a single kid had rung my doorbell. Normally, the street would be buzzing with kids and parents, but the whole neighborhood felt off. There were hardly any decorations, no laughter or chatter outside, and most of the houses had their lights off. I chalked it up to people just not feeling festive this year and decided to focus on my movie. Then the doorbell rang. I was so startled that I almost dropped the bowl of candy I had been snacking from. Finally, I thought some trick-or-treaters. I grabbed the bowl and headed to the door, but when I opened it, there was no group of kids. There was just one person. They were wearing a plain white mask, the kind you'd see in a cheap Halloween aisle. No costume, no effort, just the mask and a dark hoodie. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but they stood completely still, staring at me. Happy Halloween, I said awkwardly, holding out the candy bowl. They didn't say a word. No trick or treat, no movement, nothing. They just stood there, tilting their heads slightly, like they were studying me. I felt a weird, uneasy sensation in my gut. Something wasn't right. "Do you, want some candy?" I asked. Finally, they reached out slowly, took a piece, and walked away without saying a single word. I closed the door, shaking my head and laughing nervously to myself. "Weird," I muttered, heading back to the couch. But that weird feeling didn't go away. About an hour later, I was midway through my second beer when I heard a noise coming from outside. A faint tapping on the window near my living room. My stomach dropped. At first, I thought it might be a branch or something, but when I muted the TV, the tapping stopped. I walked over to the window and peeked through the blinds, but I didn't see anything. Still, my gut told me something was off. Then the doorbell rang again. This time I hesitated. My heart was racing as I walked to the door, but I didn't open it right away. Instead, I checked the peephole. It was the same person in the white mask. They were just standing there again, completely still. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why were they back? This wasn't normal. "Can I help you?" I called through the door, trying to sound firm. No answer. I stood there for what felt like forever, watching them through the peephole. Eventually, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I locked the door and double-checked all the windows, trying to convince myself it was just a prank. But it didn't feel like a prank. About 20 minutes later, I heard a loud thud from the back of the house. It sounded like something, or someone, had hit the back door. My chest tightened, and I grabbed the closest thing I could find for protection. A fireplace poker. I crept toward the back door, my heart pounding in my ears. I stood there, gripping the poker, trying to steady my breathing. Then I heard a voice. "Hello!" It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the house. "Hello!" The voice called again, calm and eerily polite. It took everything in me not to drop the poker. I backed up slowly, keeping my eyes on the hallway. Then I saw him, or at least I think it was him. A man stepped into the hallway, tall and lanky, wearing normal clothes. He wasn't in the mask anymore, but I just knew it was him. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "I'm looking for my kid. Have you seen a little boy? He might have come through here." His face was blank, like he wasn't really looking for an answer. My mouth went dry. "No, I haven't," I managed to say, gripping the poker tightly. "You need to leave." He didn't respond. He just stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment before turning and walking out the front door. I stood there, frozen, listening as the sound of his footsteps faded. I locked the door behind him and called the police. When they arrived, I told them everything. They searched the house and the yard, but there was no sign of him. The only thing they found was the white mask. It was sitting on the ground near the bushes by my front porch, as if he'd left it there on purpose. The cops told me it was probably some kind of prank or maybe a disturbed person, but their reassurances didn't help. The whole thing felt too deliberate. The way he came back, the way he entered my house, it wasn't random. He was testing me, seeing how I'd react. I had just finished a brutal workday, really long hours, and by the time I got home, all I wanted to do was unwind. I fired up my PC, grabbed a cold drink, and got comfortable on the couch for a solo gaming session. The house was quiet. It was just me, the screen, and the usual noises of an old home creaking as the temperature dropped outside. It was peaceful. That was until the first knock came. It was loud, sharp, and so sudden that I jumped in my seat. I paused the game and walked over to the front door. I figured it might be a neighbor or someone dropping off a package, but when I checked through the peephole, there was nobody there. The porch light was on and the steps were clear. I stood there for a minute, feeling a little weirded out, but chalked it up to someone messing around or just the wind making a strange sound. I closed the door and went back to gaming, trying to forget about it. About 20 minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't a knock. It was a clicking sound, like someone tapping on the wall or maybe a light switch turning on and off. The noise came from the direction of the hallway, and it made my skin crawl. I muted the game and sat still, listening. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, but it was odd. The kind of sound you only notice when everything else is silent. I figured it was just the house settling. This old place makes weird noises all the time. So I got up, checked the hallway, checked the kitchen, even checked the back door. Nothing seemed out of place. Everything was locked. Nothing seemed off, so I went back to the couch. Then, just as I was about to start playing again, I saw it. A shadow. It moved across my computer screen, quick but distinct. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. Maybe the reflection from the window behind me. But then I realized where the shadow was coming from. It was moving down the hallway towards my bedroom. I froze. I was frozen for what felt like forever. My brain was screaming that it was just the light playing tricks. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The shadow had been too defined, too deliberate. And the direction it was moving, straight towards my bedroom, where I had left the door slightly ajar. I turned down the volume of the game to 0 and just listened. No more clicks, no more knocks, just complete silence. That's when I heard it. The creak of floorboards coming from the direction of my bedroom. Someone was in my house. I didn't know what to do. I felt paralyzed, staring at the screen, trying to decide if I should check it out or just call the cops. The logical part of me wanted to act calm, but the other part of me was screaming to get the hell out of there before something bad happened. I made up my mind. Screw the house. Screw whatever was lurking in there. I was getting out. I grabbed my phone, shoved it in my pocket, and bolted straight out the front door. I didn't even stop to lock it behind me. I just ran. I kept running until I reached the end of the driveway and across the street, where I finally called 911. My voice was shaky when I spoke to the operator, but I somehow managed to tell them what was going on. I could barely breathe, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood across the street, watching my house, terrified that I'd see some stranger come running out. I was a mess. It didn't take long for the police to arrive. A couple of squad cars pulled up, and the officers went straight into the house. I could see their flashlights moving around through the windows. Then, a few minutes later, one of the officers came back out, walking with a man in handcuffs. He was ragged, disheveled, his hair unkempt, and his clothes torn like he'd been living on the streets. His eyes were bloodshot, his face was flushed, and he was twitching like he couldn't sit still. I could barely make out his expression, but there was something about his face that made my stomach churn. He was unpredictable. The police said they'd found him in my bedroom, just standing there, doing nothing. He wasn't trying to steal anything. He wasn't threatening me. He was just there, like he was waiting for something. But the worst part, He had two knives on him, like full-on knives. One was tucked in his jacket pocket, and the other was shoved into the waistband of his pants. No explanation, no connection to me, no reason for him to be in my house at all. The officers said it was good I left when I did, but that part didn't even register for me at the time. All I could think about was how close I had been to what could have turned into a really bad situation. What if I hadn't left? What if I had gone into the bedroom to check things out, not knowing he was in there? I kept asking myself those questions as I sat in the back of the squad car, waiting for them to finish the investigation. Eventually, the guy was hauled off to the station, but the whole thing felt surreal. I kept thinking back to the clicking sound, the shadow I saw across the screen, the way the air felt so still right before everything went down. The weirdest part? The police couldn't figure out how he got in. They searched the house, and there was no sign of forced entry. Nothing was broken, no windows were left open. It was like he had just appeared. I don't know what his plan was or why he was there, but I do know this, whatever it was, I'm lucky I noticed the shadow. I'm lucky I acted when I did. I moved in with my buddy Aaron after college. We were both broke, so finding a cheap place together was the best option. We found a little house on the edge of town. Nothing special, but it was affordable and in decent shape. We settled in quickly, unpacked our stuff, and everything seemed fine. For the first few weeks, it was just the usual. Playing video games, ordering takeout, and enjoying the new freedom of not living in a dorm anymore. Life was normal, and honestly, it was kind of nice. That was until one night when everything changed. I was working late at a job I didn't particularly like, but it paid the bills. I had a long shift and was finally heading home, looking forward to kicking back and relaxing. It was around 10 p.m. when I pulled into the driveway and noticed something off. The front door to the house was wide open. Now, we hadn't left it open, and I had a feeling I was the last one to leave this morning, so seeing it ajar was weird. I didn't freak out at first. I figured maybe Aaron just left it open on his way out, maybe to get some fresh air, or he had left in a hurry. But as I stepped inside, it hit me. Something was wrong. The house was completely dark. Every light was off, and there was an unsettling silence hanging in the air. "Hey, Aaron," I called out as I dropped my bag by the door, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. I glanced around and noticed something that made my heart skip. Aaron's phone was sitting on the kitchen counter. His phone. He never leaves his phone behind. That was when I started feeling a sense of dread creep up my spine. I walked farther into the house, trying to stay calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I called his name again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. I went to his room, figuring maybe he was taking a nap or something, but when I reached the hallway, I froze. There were strange noises coming from inside his room. It was like the sound of something shifting, a muffled scraping noise, like someone was moving around in there. My first thought was maybe it was a rat or something, but I knew something wasn't right. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. I slowly pushed the door open, and there, crouched in the corner of his room, was Aaron. He was shaking and looking at the floor like he was in some kind of trance. "Aaron?" I whispered, feeling my stomach tighten. He jumped and looked up at me, eyes wide with panic. "Dude," he said in a shaky voice, I don't know what happened. Someone was in the house. I felt a cold chill wash over me. "What do you mean? Someone was in the house?" Aaron nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just sitting here, watching TV. Then I heard footsteps like someone walking around. I thought it was you at first, but then the noises got louder. Then there were crashes like things were being knocked over. I didn't know what to do, so I just hid. I don't know what happened, man, but I didn't want to risk it." The fear in his voice was enough to make my own heart race. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't deny how strange everything was. The door was open, the lights were off, and his phone was sitting there like someone had just walked away from it. I felt a surge of panic, and I pulled out my phone to call the cops. As I was dialing, Aaron suddenly whispered, "What if they're still here?" I froze. The thought of someone still being in the house, maybe watching us, made my blood run cold. I could hear my heartbeat thumping in my ears. I couldn't think straight. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I check the rest of the house? What if the person was still inside, waiting for me to walk right into their trap? Before I could act, I heard a sound that made my stomach drop. Footsteps coming from downstairs. Someone was in the house. I grabbed Aaron's arm, pulling him into the hallway, and we ran out the back door. We didn't even stop to think. We bolted out into the yard and toward the neighbor's house, dialing 911 as we went. The police arrived within minutes, and it didn't take them long to search the place. They found the intruder in the laundry room, hiding behind the stacked dryer. It was a woman in her 30s or 40s, dressed in ragged clothes. Her eyes were wide and wild, filled with an unsettling rage, but she didn't say a word. She was breathing heavily, almost like she had been waiting for one of us to walk in. "Ma'am, are you all right?" one of the officers asked, but she didn't answer. Her eyes just flicked between him and the doorway. They arrested her, and as they led her away, I heard one of the cops say something that made my blood run cold. She had been here for a while. She knew the house. Apparently, she'd been in the house for hours, maybe longer. She had rifled through some of Aaron's stuff, made a mess in the kitchen, but didn't take anything. The most unsettling part, though, was when the police told us that she had been waiting for one of us to come back home. The way they described her, it sounded like she was fixated on one of us. Like she had been expecting me to walk in the door. She didn't know us, though. There was no connection. The police had no idea why she was there or why she was so angry, but there was something about her behavior that was off. Her rage was so focused and intense, like she was waiting for something to happen. After they took her away, Aaron and I just stood there in silence, trying to process what had just happened. The house felt different now, like it was tainted by whatever had gone down. We were both too shaken to really talk, and we just went to bed without saying much. But neither of us slept well. Every noise, every creak of the house felt like she might be back. We never found out what exactly the woman wanted, or why she targeted us. But after that night, Aaron and I decided to leave. We weren't sticking around to find out. We broke our lease and found a new place to live. I don't think I'll ever forget the look in her eyes when the police arrested her. It was a look that said she was waiting for something, waiting for us. Now, whenever I think about it, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if Aaron hadn't been hiding in his room. What if I had walked in the door a little earlier? Would she have attacked? I don't know, but I'm just glad we got out when we did. So this all started a few months ago when I decided to take a career opportunity in a small, isolated town. I had to leave my life behind in the city for a fresh start, and while the job was great, the town itself was, well, less than ideal. It's a quiet place, almost too quiet. But what really got to me was the house. I had found it online in a rental listing, and it seemed perfect. Affordable, tucked away in a nice spot, and with enough space for me to settle in. I didn't think much about it, especially since I was moving during a hectic time. I saw some pictures, read the description, and decided to go for it. The area was far from everything I was used to, but that added to the charm, right? The peace and solitude. I arrived late at night after a long drive. The town was darker than I expected, and the streets felt almost deserted. My phone GPS had struggled to find the house because of the lack of cell service out there, but I eventually found the address. The house looked like it had been around for decades. It wasn't falling apart, but it definitely had that old house vibe, creaky floors, mismatched furniture, and a general feeling of age that made the place feel a little cold. But no big deal. I was just here for work, and the house was all I could afford in this remote town. I walked inside, and there wasn't much. It was practically empty, just a mattress on the floor, some boxes, and basic furniture. It didn't look like anyone had lived there for a while, and that should have been my first clue, but I just shrugged it off. After all, it was only going to be me there, and the place seemed manageable. That first night, I was tired, so I made a quick dinner, ate, and started unpacking a few things. As I got ready for bed, I heard the first noise. It was subtle, kind of like something scratching at the walls or a floorboard creaking somewhere upstairs. I didn't think much of it at first. It was an old house, right? Houses make noises, especially when it's quiet at night. I thought it might just be some wildlife outside, maybe a raccoon or something scurrying around. But the noises didn't stop. They got louder. There was the faint sound of something dragging across the floor, the kind of noise that makes your skin crawl when you're alone in a dark house. I told myself it was just my imagination, but it felt too deliberate, too close. I tried to focus on something else, turning on the TV and trying to drown out the sounds. But when I started hearing the soft thump 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 from above, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't figure out where the noises were coming from. They were all over the house, some from the walls, some from the ceilings. It was unnerving, but I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe the old would just settled in strange ways. And then, the door to my bedroom swung open. It didn't creak, it just opened. Slowly, like someone was pushing it from the other side. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't see anyone, but I could hear the faint sound of footsteps shuffling away, heading down the hallway. The hairs on my neck stood up. I didn't know what to think. For a second, I told myself it was the wind or just the house shifting again. But then I heard the footsteps again. This time, much closer, right outside my bedroom door. I was shaking by this point. I got up, heart pounding, and slowly walked over to the door, trying to peek out into the dark hallway. That's when I saw it. A man. A figure sprinting past my bedroom door. It was too fast for me to process, but I knew what I had seen. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, and he moved like he was trying to hide. I couldn't make out his face, but it didn't matter. The adrenaline hit me like a freight train. I ran. I didn't even think. I just grabbed my phone, bolted out the door, and jumped into my car. I didn't even stop to lock the door behind me. I just started the engine and sped out of the driveway as fast as I could, hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't know if the guy was still in the house or if he was following me, but I wasn't about to find out. I parked in a well-lit area and immediately called the police. I couldn't explain it well. I was panicked, my heart racing, trying to get the words out through my shallow breaths. I could barely finish the story before they told me to stay where I was and wait for them to come. It felt like hours, but the cops eventually showed up. When they went inside the house, I stayed in my car, watching the windows. They were in there for a while, searching the place. When they finally came back out, they didn't give me much detail, but they said they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows or doors. They didn't seem all that concerned, but they said they'd stay on the lookout. They suggested maybe someone had been living there when the house was unoccupied. Someone who knew the layout and was familiar with the place. But it didn't sit right with me. If that were the case, why would he be running through my house like that? And why was he so quiet? I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just some random squatter. I ended up breaking the lease the next day. I didn't care how much it cost me. I just wanted out. I couldn't get the image of that man out of my mind, and the thought of staying in that house any longer made my stomach turn. I still don't know what exactly happened that night. Maybe it was just a break-in gone wrong, or maybe it was someone who had been living there all along. But whatever it was, I'm just glad I woke up in time to avoid whatever he had planned. I've always been someone who values privacy. I mean, who wouldn't? So, when I found this little secluded house on the outskirts of town, it felt like a dream come true. It was perfect, quiet, surrounded by trees, and far enough from the hustle and bustle of the city to actually feel peaceful. No nosy neighbors, no noise, just me and the open space. I moved in about a month ago, and for the most part, it's been great. That is, until I met him. I was out in my front yard, cleaning up some branches when I saw someone walking up my driveway. At first, I thought it was just someone lost, maybe looking for directions or something. But as he got closer, I realized it was a man I'd never seen before. He was in his mid-50s, dressed in a flannel shirt and jeans, nothing unusual about that. He smiled at me, but it was off. Like, his smile wasn't quite right, you know? but I didn't think much of it and waved back. "Hey there, I'm your neighbor," he said, his voice a little too high-pitched for a guy his age. "I live down the road, just a little ways." "Nice to meet you," I said, trying to keep things polite. He introduced himself as Carl, and it didn't take long before he started asking all these strange questions. "How do you like it out here? It's nice and quiet, right? Not too lonely?" He went on and on about how peaceful it is in the area, but there was something weird about his tone. Like he wasn't just making small talk. It felt like he was probing me, trying to figure something out. The conversation didn't last too long, but when he left, I got this strange feeling in my stomach. Something about him didn't sit right. Still, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe just some weird guy who's too friendly, or maybe I was just overthinking it. You know how it is. Sometimes you get those vibes from people, but they turn out to be harmless. But Carl kept coming back. At first, it was just small visits. He'd knock on my door, sometimes during the day, sometimes late in the evening. I'd open the door, and there he'd be, standing there with that same unsettling smile. It wasn't always the same reason either. Sometimes he'd want to check in and see how I was settling in. Other times it was just to chat about nothing. He'd talk about the weather or the town like he had nothing else to do. The more he came around, the stranger he got. He'd stand a little too close, linger a little too long, and make these comments that didn't make sense. Like one time he told me, "You've got a nice place here, you know? A real nice place. Not many folks out here, but that's good, right? Keeps the noise down." It was as if he was trying to say something without actually saying it. It started to feel like he was watching me, and it wasn't just a casual hello anymore. One night, things took a turn. I had just gotten home from running errands, and as I pulled into the driveway, I saw Carl standing by my front door. He wasn't knocking or ringing the bell. He was just standing there. I felt this weird, tight knot in my chest. I hadn't seen him in a couple of days, so I thought maybe he just wanted to say hello, but something about him didn't feel right. I quickly grabbed my stuff, locked the car, and walked up to the door. "Hey, Carl," I said, trying to keep it casual. "Evening," he replied, his voice a little raspy. "I was just wondering if you had a minute. I wasn't in the mood for a chat. Look, I've had a long day. I really need to get inside. Can we catch up some other time?" He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me with that strange, blank smile. "Oh, I think it's important we talk now," he said. "You've been out here for a while. You're sure everything's okay, right?" I started to get this sick feeling in my stomach. I wasn't sure if he was trying to make a point, but I wasn't going to let it go any further. "I really don't have time right now," I said firmly. "I'll see you around." I reached for the doorknob to close the door, but before I could, Carl took a step forward. He wasn't rushing at me or anything, but he was way too close for comfort. I backed up instinctively, and that's when I saw it. He had something in his hand, a long, gleaming knife. My heart stopped, couldn't breathe. The knife was big, sharp, and for a second I thought I might pass out. "What the hell is this, Carl?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't respond at first, just stared at me. His smile was gone, replaced by something that made my skin crawl. "I just want to make sure you're safe here," he said in a calm, almost eerie tone. "People like you, people who move into quiet places like this, they need to be protected." I don't know how I did it, but I slammed the door in his face and locked it. I didn't even think. I grabbed my phone, hands trembling, and called 911. The police showed up within minutes. By the time they arrived, Carl was gone, but they scoured the property and the surrounding area. They found no trace of him. No car, no footprints, nothing. It was like he just vanished. But here's the part that still freaks me out. When they went to check his address, they couldn't find anyone who matched his description living nearby. They couldn't even find a record of anyone named Carl at all. No one had heard of him, and they couldn't trace him back to the area. They said it could be a random person, maybe someone living in the woods or someone who's not supposed to be around. But honestly, I don't buy it. Carl had been coming around too often, and his behavior wasn't just strange. It was dangerous. The worst part, I haven't seen him since that night, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still around.